Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this month's In Search of Truth program hosted by the Wende Museum. My name is Lexi, and I'm so excited, along with my fellow panelists, to welcome Vijay Gupta as our special guest for this afternoon discussion of truth and music. Vijay Gupta is a violinist, speaker, and citizen artist dedicated to creating spaces of wholeness through music. His work embodies his belief that the work of artists and citizens is one, to make a sadhana or a daily practice of the world that we envision. Hailed by the New Yorker as a visionary violinist, one of the most radical thinkers in the unradical world of classical music, American classical music, Vijay leads a diverse career and as a thought leader, performer, collaborator, and communicator. He is the founder and artistic director of Street Symphony, a community of musicians creating spaces of connection for people in reentry from homelessness, addiction, and incarceration in Los Angeles. Vijay is also a co-founder of the Skid Row Arts Alliance, a consortium dedicated to creating art for and with the largest homeless community in America. For his work in bringing beauty, respite, and purpose to those all too often ignored by society, Vijay was a recipient of a 2018 MacArthur Fellowship. He has performed as an international recitalist, soloist, chamber musician, and a musician for over 20 years. He was a member of the first violin section of the Los Angeles Philharmonic for 12 years and has collaborated with the Kronos Quartet, the Philharmonia Orchestra of London, Yo-Yo Ma, and appears regularly with the Strings Festival in Steamboat Springs, Colorado. A dynamic recording artist, Vijay recently released Breathe, an album of the piano chamber music of Rina Esmail under his own label, which is currently available on Bandcamp. Vijay currently serves as the Senior Artistic and Programs Advisor for the Young Musicians Foundation. Today's program will feature a 45-minute discussion with Mr. Gupta, moderated by the Vende's Chief Curator, Hughes, and followed by a 15-minute Q&A. If you have any questions, we urge you to type them into the Q&A box that is located at the bottom of your Zoom screen at any point throughout the program, although please keep the questions clear and concise. Mr. Gupta, it is a pleasure and privilege to have you with us this afternoon. On the behalf of the In Search of Truth Student Council, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
And really quickly, we would like to extend our special thanks to Susan Horowitz and Rick Feldman for generously supporting this discussion at the Vende. Now to you to begin the conversation.
All right, Lexi, thank you so much. And Vijay, also welcome on my behalf. It's so great to see you again.
And thank you, Jus. Thank you.
No, absolutely. So earlier we had sessions about truth and education, truth and war, truth and society. Last month we had guest speaker Soraya Chadaravian on truth and science. And it might seem that the combination of truth and music is a little bit less logical or maybe counterintuitive, but we all think that it is a really essential aspect in our quest for the concept of truth. So it's great to have you. And also I can't imagine a better guest speaker for this topic, because no one is as eloquent and inspiring about the power of music and the connection with society as you are. Also, I want to mention that the stars clearly align, because yesterday happened to be World Music Day. So we are in a good spot here. Let's open the discussion with Hannah, who has a point about the non-discursive character of music and what that implies.
Yeah, absolutely. I think looking at truth in music, the common thread there seems to be some form of communication. And so I was wondering if you think that music has the ability to communicate things that words can't, and sort of how that connects to truth.
It's a beautiful question, and I'll first just to say it's such an honor to be here and such an honor to be back, sort of in the room of the Vende. And I think, we've rediscovered and reoriented ourselves to what being together means, and it's really lovely to feel welcomed again into this space of questioning, because I think we come together and connect with each other more through questions and through inquiry than we do through sort of easily consumed answers which are positioned to be truths. When I was thinking about this idea of music and truth, I was reminded of the words of John Keats, the last two lines of his poem Ode to a Grecian Urn, where he says, beauty is truth and truth beauty. That is all you know on earth and all you need to know. And when I think about, answer to your beautiful question, Hannah, of course, there's so much music which accompanies words, which amplify words, and so it's not only to say that music communicates something that words can't, but I think that music places us in, perhaps from the left hemisphere of the brain, which is analytical and always critical and looking for answers, to this more opening, metaphoric, creative, perhaps right side of the brain, where we're seeking out the whole, as opposed to seeking out the part or the analysis. And so there's something about the connecting power of music which allows us to immediately place ourselves in a different kind of knowing, a different space of being, which could be called something ineffable, something transcendent, something where we're suspending judgment and returning to this place of questioning. And so I think that the beauty that perhaps Keats was talking about is this beauty of something. I mean, Keats was writing about an ancient Greek urn, this decrepit pot, basically, and he saw beauty in it. I'm thinking also of the amazing poem of, I think it's of Rilke, where he's talking about this broken marble bust of Apollo. What is it about beauty in something broken and in ruins that still draws us in? What is it about finding beauty in perhaps the objects which are in the amazing exhibit at the Wende, which perhaps were part of everyday life and not taken as something beautiful when they were first made, but perhaps had more utility? What truths and stories do these objects illuminate for us? So I think I'll pause there. The short answer is music opens us up to inquiry and helps us suspend judgment.
Right, and I'm so happy that you mentioned also the Rilke poem, because as you know, Wende from Wende Museum means change or transition. But actually, if I'm not mistaken, the title of that poem is "You Must Change Your Life."
There it is.
Yeah, right. So let's go to Gianna, who connects the concept of truth or the concept of personal truth with experiencing music.
Yes, I had a question more connecting your own personal connection with music. And I was wondering, can you think of any music that you've played or listened to that you see as conveying your own personal truth? And how would you describe this piece and how it encapsulates that specific truth that you have?
So what's really interesting about music and the truths that we can tell, and I say truths multiple, truths plural, that we can tell through music is, imagine a note, for example, like the note A. When I was in the LA Philharmonic, the orchestra would tune to the note A, but there were many different A's. Perhaps an A could be A440, meaning 440 hertz per second. That's an A. But sometimes some orchestra would tune to A equals 442 or A equals 445, and we all had to literally tune to the same A. It was still an A, but we weren't playing in tune unless we had all attuned to the same note. And so in Western classical music, we kind of move from notes that are written on the page, like an A to a B to a C, and as we move from these notes, we move to, from arrival point to arrival point to arrival point, from truth to truth to truth. I grew up listening to Indian classical music, particularly music from my parents' home state of Bengal, their home city of Kolkata. And I grew up in the US. I was a child of these two Bengali immigrants who loved Bengali folk music, but they also loved Rod Stewart and Julio Iglesias. And they listened to all different kinds of music. And I happened to grow up playing Western classical music, but I always felt like an outsider in my own music, quote unquote, my own music, the music of Indian classical musicians. And in Indian classical music, the truth is never at the arrival points. The truth is in the in-between. So notes are actually not so much about arrival points, but about sliding in between notes. And so the truth is all in this gray area that happens in between the notes. That's where the expression lies, not in arrivals, but in the journeys. So when I begin to play the music of, Indian classical musicians, namely the music of Rina Esmail, who happens to be my wife, is also the composer in residence of the LA Master Chorale and recently of the Seattle Symphony. She has created ways to bring Western musicians into dialogue with Indian classical musicians. And so when I play her music, for many different reasons, I find myself coming alive and I find myself telling different stories, I find myself open to new truths about myself that I'm constantly discovering. But I'll also say that playing that kind of music allows me to go back and play the music of all the old dead white guys I love, i.e. Bach and Beethoven and Mozart, to reorient myself to their thinking and their music, because we put their music on a pedestal and kind of think of these composers as these calcified marble busts of expression, whereas they were all master improvisers. And Indian classical music is an improvised tradition. So I am now wondering if the truth of expression in Western classical music is actually rooted in the possibility born from improvisation, as opposed to the rote learning of the notes on the page.
Beautiful, and that's maybe something that jazz music brought back into the tradition. So from this question about personal truth, there is another question about the connection between truth and beliefs and perspectives. And Megana, I think it's a very nice follow-up to the last point.
Yeah, definitely. I think my question connects to both Hannah's and Gianna's, because you talked a lot about how music opens you to new truths, it opens to inquiry and suspends judgment. Do you think, like, once that space is created, do you think art has the power to transform our beliefs and perspectives? In what ways have you seen, heard, or engaged with art that has altered the way you view something?
This is a beautiful way to enter into talking a little bit about the work that I am lucky enough to do in and with the Skid Row community of downtown Los Angeles. So for the last nearly 12 years, I've been involved with bringing music, not just Western classical music, but choral, jazz, mariachi, reggae, son jarocho, West African drumming, various music of various different traditions and forms, to shelters, clinics, county jails, prisons, all over Los Angeles County. This is an organization called Street Symphony. And when I started this work, I had a belief, a perspective that music was a healing force and that I was the one to impart that healing unto people who never had a chance to come to the concert hall. Essentially, I thought that I was doing a kind of musical outreach. But when I started making music in Skid Row, it was actually the audiences in clinics and shelters and county jails who refused to buy in to the construct of decorum and good behavior that I was used to in a concert hall. And so I'll never forget, I was playing a really stormy Beethoven string quartet in C minor, the Opus 18 number 4 string quartet, and I was in the Department of Mental Health clinic playing for people with experiences of chronic mental illness, chronic homelessness. And halfway through the first movement, a woman in the very front row of the clinic audience, she put her hand in the air, and her hand was like 5 inches from my face. And I kind of recoiled while I was playing because I wasn't expecting like intimate human contact while I was playing. And she just kept her hand up the whole time. She had an insistent question. And then when we finished the movement, I called on her, and she didn't have a question. She offered her truth. She offered her story. And she just kept talking and talking and talking of how in this music she heard her parents screaming at each other. She heard her protecting her sister. She heard her and her sister making up games so that they felt safe while their parents screamed at each other. She became so much more than someone who was the recipient of outreach. she insisted on naming and claiming her humanity in that moment. And her humanity was more than my belief that she was the sole recipient of the healing, right? Her story healed me. And I would actually go so far as to say her story healed my conception of Beethoven. Because when I thought about the composer, that was around the time when he was really grappling with going deaf. He had just written a letter to his brothers called the Heilige Stadt Testament, where it was essentially his suicide note. He said, I don't have the hope and will to live anymore. This music is the only thing I have to offer, and I can't even hear myself make it anymore. And so something about his despair and transforming that despair into the artistic offering felt like a connecting point for me, transforming my desire to connect with that audience and transforming her and her story as being just a condition into an offering and a gift. So when I think about the power of music, it really is that experience changes the way that we understand and see each other. I think about art making both as a mirror and a lens. It's a way for us to see our highest selves, but it's a way for us to look through the experience and see one another as well. And that allows us to understand truth as continuous and fluid and ever-changing.
Beautiful, thank you. Ashla, do you want to follow up on this point?
Yeah, I mean, you've spoken a bit to this, but I would love to hear more about like the dynamics maybe within the Street Symphony and like how you yourself has like grown as an individual after like interacting with people as a teacher and as a performer. So my question is, while much of your work as a musician has been as a soloist, there must have been like very important communities that shaped you as an artist, social activist, and individual. And so have you seen these music-based communities make positive change as a result of their communal creative output and like the interpersonal relationships within them?
Yeah, oh, there's so much there. I want to step back and name a few things. One is the various communities that have made me. You know, I grew up being very lucky to study at incredible conservatories with amazing teachers who taught me to play at the highest standards of musical expression. You know, I had teachers who taught me how to play incredible technical things, you know, and yet they were also continuously modeling for me how to be a person. You know, I feel like I learned from them how to be in the world. And so much of how they created music had to do with how they made people feel. And so I think I not only learned from my teachers how I wanted to sound and play, I learned from them how I wanted to make other people feel. And when I think about great performers, I've been lucky enough to work with musicians like Yo-Yo Ma, for example. The idea of them being a performer kind of disappears because they've made you feel welcome. And I think ideally that's what a great performance does. It makes you feel welcome. Or a great piece of art makes you feel welcome. Even if it's challenging you, it makes you feel welcome in the challenge, right? And then I also want to clarify the sort of idea around social activism, because I've been actually challenging this concept within myself, because when I go to Skid Row, I never say to people in Skid Row, I'm here to be an activist for you. Of course, there's a sense of advocacy, there's a sense of connection, but really it's about love. And I feel like we need to reclaim this idea of love and relationship as being the cornerstone of how and why this work happens, and the only point of softness within ourselves at which we really allow ourselves to change. Because what I've learned from making music in Skid Row and the ways in which I've changed is because I started to have to let love in as much as that sounds like a Beatles lyric, right? I had to let that in to myself, because I used to go to Skid Row saying, I'm here to heal you, I'm here to heal you, I'm here to heal you. And there'd be people in Skid Row who said, dude, you're the one who needs the healing here. You know, you're the one who needs to show up to this event for you. So claim that. So I didn't want to name the fact that I wanted to be in Skid Row out of a way of being selfish. But of course, I think there's something in art making and in social change that we should claim is related to love and self-love. My act of self-love is to show up to this community with an act of commitment and compassion, and to also show up with my highest artistic practice. So I'm going to pause there. I'm not sure that fully answers your question. I'll let you tell me if you'd like me to go in a little bit further, but I just wanted to speak to a couple of those points.
Great. Yeah. Ashley, you want to?
Yeah. I was just going to say, I mean, it's beautiful to see, you know, your technical training in the way that translates in like a more contemporary space, you know, like working with traditional work and then being like in the present moment with other people. Like the way I understand it is music is like a whole language in itself where it can be both emotive and very technical in its own way. And I think, you know, really highlighting the aspects of it that can just be purely like an emotional and immediate connection with others is, I think, the best way to approach music making, and the way that you are sort of performing with people as you play to them and hear their responses. And like having that woman's hand in your face like must have been emotional on some level too, like where you're understanding her, you know?
Yeah, and I think that sort of speaks to your point around change, right? Because change is co-created. You know, there is change which happens to us all the time, right? Change is the only constant, really. But I've been wondering about this idea of practice and an artistic practice. That practice is really the change we choose, you know, and the kind of change that we hold our attention to is not a change that we control. You know, and so the way that change emerges in Skid Row is not to say, change has been accomplished because X number of people have been housed. Rather, it's to say change happens in the moment. It's a feeling. It's a truth that we embody and we are constantly open to. It's sort of like Martin Buber's I-thou relationship, right? It's the fact that we're constantly putting on each other's perspective of ourselves and then saying, is this me? Is this you? Is this you? Is this me? And that change is happening in that constant gyroscopic orientation of ourselves towards one another. It's not to say, change is accomplished, therefore the relationship is over. I hope to never accomplish that kind of change.
Okay. Emma, do you want to comment on this and maybe you can slightly adapt, I guess, your question to follow up on this discussion? Yeah.
Yeah. First of all, I just want to say that like the last 5 minutes of conversation has like really struck me. I've like entered a new emotion, like myself right now in this conversation. So thank you for that. And like, I suppose this question isn't a negative one per se, but I think, you know, there are a lot of people, unfortunately, in this world that do not approach things and hard conversations and challenging situations with the kind of love and compassion that we hope to embody. And I'm curious for how you both emotionally as a human moving through the world, but also logistically, what do you do when someone's vision of what the world should be contradicts your own? How do you approach that person with love and compassion as well, but still, you know, for lack of a better term, get the job done?
One of the first times I went into Twin Towers Jail in downtown Los Angeles, I didn't realize that this place is effectively the planet's largest psychiatric institution. I was going into Twin Towers Jail with colleagues from the LA Philharmonic for Street Symphony events. And during that time, the current sheriff of LA County and the sheriff's department was under federal investigation by the Department of Justice for human rights violations in that very same jail. So individuals, and this is perhaps a bit of a trigger warning, but individuals who had expressed suicidal ideation, there were inmates who were tossing in lengths of rope into the cells. And I had been in touch with a lot of prison abolishment organizations, human rights organizations, and I was really split because they said, how on earth can you go into that place? How on earth can you partner with the sheriff's department when they are doing this? And then I had other mentors who said, you have to go in. You have to go in because you're the only one who can go in and play for those individuals. And so, it was interesting because I was sort of holding being canceled on both ends in a sense, because I would then shake hands with deputies, and I would be wondering, is this one of them? Is this one of these people who did that thing? And then at the end of the event, I would see people who were wearing yellow jumpsuits with tears in their eyes, and I would see the deputies wearing green uniforms with tears in their eyes. And I would walk out and have to hold back tears in my eyes. And so it's to say that we cannot force alignment. But what we can practice is the resonance of some kind of edge of values, even if that edge is the thinnest possible margin, right? If we start the conversation with values and even the practice of values, then I believe that we can create something together, even if what you think we're creating and what I think we're creating are two completely different things. And so it's to say, I'm struck by this concept of compromiso. Compromiso is a term I learned from colleagues in the son jarocho tradition. The son jarocho is a tradition of Mexican folk music which emerges from the state of Veracruz. It's an amazing, actually it's the Baroque Mexican tradition. The instruments on which son jarocho is performed are actually instruments which came from Venice around the time of Vivaldi, but they're actually tuned like Arabic instruments like the oud. It's an incredible musical form. And so in son jarocho music, they talk about the idea of compromiso, that musicians are kind of like shamans, that musicians are given the possibility of going away from the community to actually go and practice. And the compromiso is actually not a compromise as we think of it, but rather a shared promise. That's actually what compromise means. Compromise, shared promise. But the idea that the artist will go away and work on their craft, but that the artist will come back to the society and unveil a certain kind of truth. And the society will sit and listen and take in that truth, even when that truth challenges their idea of who they are, right? And that is the compromise that I feel I've tried to embody when it comes to street symphony work, especially in talking with policymakers, funders, artists, musicians who I don't believe in. Rather, musicians who don't, all of the people who don't believe in the same perspective that I have, but to say, where do we align? Okay, if we align on making music together, then let's make that music together. Let's just happen to do it in this space. And then let's see. Will you be in relationship long enough with me to disagree? So that we can at least disagree together in the same room. As long as we keep disagreeing together in the same room, we still have a relationship. So I wonder about that.
Right.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, Emma. Yeah.
Sorry, just like quickly to add on, and I think like that is really important, that like in order to live our most genuine truths, we are going to brush up against people, and like I don't know, like there is a way of looking at disagreements that can be positive, because if you're disagreeing, you're showing up as yourself. You're not compromising your own. You're compromising with others. Thank you for.
And I think part of what is the action takeaway from that is compromiso relies also on us being really clear about what our values are and what the practice of our values are. And so there is that moment of solitude. Rilke writes so much about the power of solitude. This idea that solitude is so critical because it's where we find our truths, and where we practice our truths. Then when we offer those truths to the world, that's an offering. It's not an insistence that the way we offer it or the truths we offer are the truths that the audience should feel. We can never control what the audience feel, but we can control what and how we practice.
And I think the shared promise is a beautiful concept, but given the fact that we are experiencing a time where lying is made a kind of art form in current politics, and I guess that makes it very hard to follow that concept of compromiso. And actually, Lexi, I think you have a question that goes in that direction.
Mine kind of goes with Emma, but kind of Similarly, what are the boundaries and or limitations that you've experienced that music has in inspiring others to like actually work for change?
Yeah, I mean, that word is so critical, the word boundaries, because of course there is a point where we do have to appreciate. And no, I think there was a question of someone who asked, like, how do you keep going? And it's to say sometimes you don't. And I will also say that this work is very emotionally taxing. There is a lot of burnout, secondary trauma that happens. Always talking to a support staff and team and therapists and organizational coaches. So yes, that goes with all the work that happens. And there is also the intractable. There is the idea that, for a while, now, Lexi, to speak to your question, for a while, Street Symphony embodied the mission of art and music at the heart of social justice. And I really had to challenge that definition of what we did, because it became a really important way of defining what social justice meant. Were we housing people? Were we feeding people? Were we clothing people? Were we changing policy directly? No. And it's not to say that it wasn't justice work. I mean, it wasn't the practice of justice. But it is also to go back to the kind of faith and trust in the artistic process, specifically in the relational process of co-creating art, that allows us to understand new ways of being. I believe that if we can inhabit those new ways of being and create sustainable models of relation and interaction, then we can create the policies which allow those new ways of being to flourish. One of my mentors is a man named Quetzal Flores. He's an amazing son jarocho musician. Quetzal's band is called Quetzal. I encourage all of you to go check out their music. But Quetzal talks about how any policy needs to have a culture in place to receive it. And so it is the work of cultural practitioners and artists to create those cultures. And culture is not just a matter of creating a piece of art. It's about creating that dialogical process of art and receptivity and art, that co-creative process over and over and over, to then say, hey, we have created a new way of being. We have our own policies and ways of being intact. Now we need the legislation to support it. I think that's how we move towards developing a critical mass towards policy change.
And Meghana, you have a question about maybe the drive or the necessity for artists to express themselves socially and politically. Of course, this already touches upon some of the things we have been talking about, but I think your question actually makes it more specific. So please go ahead.
Yeah, definitely. So we've talked a little bit about the intersection of social change and art. Do you believe artists have a responsibility to become involved in certain social and political issues?
We already are involved. We're all involved. We're all involved by the fact that we draw breath. I think the fact that there is a separation in that is a construct, right? We in arts we talk about the fourth wall, the sort of us and them. And I think the fourth wall is an amazing metaphor for the master classes of structural violence that we see playing out in a city like Los Angeles. I mean, the fact that Skid Row exists within walking distance of Bunker Hill is a masterclass in conscious design and in structural violence. So, of course, we are all, I would say, not only involved, I would actually even go further to say we're complicit. We have a responsibility in the sense that we have the ability to respond. We all have the ability to respond. And I don't mean to go into guilt or privilege necessarily, but rather to talk about what can we do with the gifts and skills that we have? How do we pay attention to the world around us? How do we lean into and undo the fourth walls? And I'm struck by words of Bob Marley. Practice emancipation of yourself. Work the emancipation on your own mind. Free yourself from mental slavery, and thinking about His Holiness the Dalai Lama, who talks about practicing internal disarmament. Right? I would love for us to come back to this place where we're consciously undoing the fourth wall within ourselves. And I believe that we have created policies which ostracize and criminalize the most fragile and vulnerable people, or rather the people we call the most fragile and vulnerable, because we have ostracized the most fragile and vulnerable parts of ourselves. I see a direct link between that internal practice and the external manifestation. And so how do we draw those lines back and forth together? And I'll give a concrete example, which is to say, I've been talking about Street Symphony and how at first I was really holding myself apart from the audiences in Skid Row. I did not want to see myself in the people we were playing for in shelters and clinics and county jails. And yet it was often people in Skid Row who would say to me, "Sweetheart, baby, you're hurting today. What's going on?" And I would say, "Well, shit, am I hurting today? Oh, I am. How can they see that?" And it was in being with people who were so emotionally attuned, who had a wisdom and a knowledge of human suffering and pain that I never had. And it was that I had to accept, again, their love as a way of healing myself. And so when I had created the conditions for connection, when I had created the conditions for healing and undoing the fourth wall for others, the fourth wall came tumbling down inside myself. And so it's to say that, I don't ever think that identity or change or artistry is created in a vacuum. I think it's always created in relationship, whether we're willing to acknowledge that or not. And this might sound like a paradox when it comes to talking about deep artistic practice, but I even think that there's a difference between isolation and solitude. Rilke writes about this kind of glowing solitude, the communion of making art by yourself, and that you're still connected to something bigger than yourself, even when you're alone. And that's different than solipsism. It's different than isolation.
Right. And that seems to also beautifully connect to a very beautiful term you coined, radical mutuality. And Natalie has a question about that term.
Yes, kind of further to your point about the fourth wall, leaning into it, undoing it. You've spoken of the need for, I'm quoting you here, a vulnerable process of radical mutuality and honesty in order to begin envisioning ourselves as belonging to a global family. So I'm wondering, what do radical mutuality and honesty look like? And what are the implications for truth writ large?
Well, I think it really means listening to discomfort. When we started Street Symphony, I was calling the events that we did concerts. And slowly that started to change, because the idea of the audience as passive consumers of entertainment was absolutely not happening. Or folks in Skid Row, again, because they didn't buy into the decorum of the hall, were active participants. These concerts became conversations. And I started to realize that the conversation was this kind of mutual offering, which came back from the audience. It was a chance to hear people's stories and eventually hear people's music, right? And so instead of concerts, we started calling these listening circles. These are sort of these reciprocal loops. And I'm reminded of the work of an amazing author whom I would recommend to everyone, named Lewis Hyde, who's written a number of books, but one of the most famous is The Gift. And this idea that all art making is a gift, a reciprocal mutual gift. He references a number of practices from indigenous societies, such as the potlatch ceremony, where it's an act of giving with such abandon, giving with such abundance, that you actually place yourself in a position of being indebted to the other person. It's almost like giving so generously that you need to rely on the other, which is really a gift. I heard a story once of, if you move to a new neighborhood, don't go introduce yourself to a new neighbor by offering them cake or, a Jell-O mold, but rather ask for a favor. Because you've created the wealth by kind of creating a sort of social indebtedness. And then when that person needs something from you, they're willing to ask. And so it's a sense of creating that, again, that relationship. And that can look very small. That habit of generosity can simply look like making the space to listen, like the space to say hello, and not even hello to someone who might be experiencing homelessness, but perhaps hello to a support staff, hello to a janitor, hello to an intern, hello to the person who's checking you out at the cashier. How's your day going? What's going on today? How are you? And I think that when we open ourselves up to that, in more and more settings, we're also opening ourselves up to receiving more than we bargained for. And that might be uncomfortable. I'll share. I'm aware of time. I know I tell a lot of stories, but I just want to share this. That I was recently on a flight returning from DC to LA, and I was really pissed because the flight was delayed. And the flight was delayed. We were on the tarmac, and then they said, we have to deplane, engine trouble. All of us are grumbling. I was like, I could have gotten 3 more hours of sleep, so on and so forth. So I'm leaving the plane, grumbling, sitting there, eating the bagel I didn't want to buy. And I say hi to the lady who's sitting across from me at the on the other side of the table, and we struck up a conversation. And what was amazing about this conversation was that she was flying to LA to be with someone, her partner, who was actually passing away from a terminal illness. And that she was coming to be with this person. She had been a trauma EMT paramedic. Now she was a paramedic supervisor. She herself had survived a traumatic brain injury, had retaught herself to walk and talk using music therapy as a way to rewire her brain. And I was like, you ass. The fact that you had this frame of mind where you might have missed this conversation. Right? Where you might have not said hello to this person. Who knows how many more people we didn't meet, how many more stories we didn't hear because we didn't take the time. And I started getting antsy and uncomfortable while she was sharing the story. And then I said to myself, shut up. Shut up and listen, because this is the point of connection, right? This is the inexorable gift that comes when we pay attention to each other in radically mutual ways. So I really hope that that story lands in some way, but it's to say this openness. How do we practice openness and curiosity? Because I kind of feel like the world is like an octopus offering its tentacles, and if we're willing, there's so many connections to be had.
Right. And Vijay, you are definitely presenting us with a big gift today. Thank you for that. I think this is actually a good moment to move to the Q&A. There are already several questions, and the Q&A today will be moderated by Hannah. So over to you, Hannah.
Yeah, I mean, this has all been so eye-opening and wonderful and really given me a lot to chew on and to think about. You've spoken a lot about your own personal changes and growth, both in the way that you view yourself, but also in how you view others and how you interact with the world. Is there any specific piece of music that you've played that's altered your perspective on things in the world?
Well, I think that every piece of music I inhabit offers an opportunity for that change to happen. And as an artist, I am continuously embodying the perspectives of the composers or the creators, even if I'm improvising, which is really rather terrifying for me as a classically trained musician. I was recently at the California Institution for Women playing for a group of incarcerated women with life sentences. And I've been at CIW. It's actually a prison in Chino, not too far from where we are here in Southern California. And I was playing the amazing violin and cello duo by Maurice Ravel. And I was playing with a wonderful Japanese cellist named Yoshi Masuda, who's a professor here in Los Angeles. And Yoshi was telling me about this metaphor of the Japanese word sensei. And sensei in Japanese means teacher, but it literally means a head on the road. And in the music of Ravel, in the third movement, the cello starts alone, ahead on the road, and plays a whole phrase, and then the violin comes in something called canon, like row, row, row your boat, literally playing the same music as what the cello just played, just an octave higher. And we used this metaphor of sensei to talk about mentorship, and how this music actually allowed us to start a conversation with the women in the audience about who are your mentors. And so many women in the room pointed to older women who were also there in the room with them, who they had known for decades, who had just been further along on the road than them. And this became a beautiful way for us to talk about mentorship and teaching and training. So it's to say that all pieces of music hold the possibility to offer that seed of connection, and for me, what I love as an artist is to be able to adapt and change and draw various different seeds, regardless of the music, regardless of the genre. I mean, for me personally, I am absolutely in love with the music of Johann Sebastian Bach, and if I could give a little plug, actually this Saturday at 8 p.m. at Inner City Arts in downtown Los Angeles, Street Symphony is presenting a public performance of the amazing cantata of Johann Sebastian Bach called Ich habe genug, which in German means I am fulfilled or I have enough. And it's an amazing meditation on death and transition and loss and change. But between every movement of Bach, we will have a narrator from the Skid Row community sharing her own stories of reentry, homelessness, redemption, forgiveness. And so what I love is reframing, reorienting, perhaps in subversive and tricky ways, the music of the great masters to make them relative to where we are now. I want to transform this music into soul food, and I think that all music offers that intersection to become soul food.
Yeah, that theme of transformation and sort of transportation to another area, I think, has really been constant throughout this conversation. And another question we have is that sometimes the value of music is to transport us to imaginary places and to allow us to live in a fantasy for a little while. How does that relate to truth-telling?
How beautiful, right? Because we often kind of live in this paradox that the imaginative is not real. Right? I think about, I'm a huge Harry Potter nut. Does everyone remember what Dumbledore said to Harry Potter when they departed for the last time? Of course it's happening in your head, but that doesn't mean it's not real. Right? And so it's this thing of being able to understand that sometimes living in imagination or even living in fantasy is not just a fun coping mechanism. It might be more true than true. It might allow us the space to imagine and embody a truth that we then have to be physically brave enough to embody or create or manifest. And I wonder if that's actually the seed of all art making itself, but also the seed of all visioning, all imagination. I don't want to exclude the fact that I think, I'm not a parent myself, but I imagine parenting to be an incredibly difficult and imaginative task. I imagine policy making to be an incredibly difficult and imaginative task. I imagine that all kinds of acts that we consider non-artistic are really at their core rooted in artistic practices. I rely on certain types of music when I work out because I'm so miserable and I'm in so much pain that I need to get pumped up by something to just make me get through the rest of the damn cardio session, right? And so, fine, whatever that is, I will pump my Katy Perry and roar along so that I can finish being on the bike, and fine, whatever imaginative world that allows me to live in, I'm still getting my workout in. So I don't know, I'll respond that way. Just because it's imaginative doesn't mean that it's an escape.
Absolutely. I think the imagination can be so real if we let it. And I think that also really applies to our conversation about the fourth wall and how it's this imaginary barrier that we put up to kind of separate us from others, and it has very real consequences in that way. And so another question that we have is, do you think that music could perhaps be one of the keys to bridging that gap between the homeless and the rest of society and help humanize these real people who are often looked down upon, often to no fault of their own?
Yeah, I think the issue, a real part of the issue is how we see each other and how we see ourselves, right? The othering of another person, the myth that in some way this person is not me, this person could never be me. So much of the fourth wall. I think on either side of the fourth wall is faith and doubt, and imagination requires real faith. It requires the sustaining power of faith and momentum and practice in order to bring us towards constructing change. But the moment that doubt creeps in, whether it's that pernicious voice of self-criticism or the more real voices of doubt from externalized sources, it places us in a place of smallness and fear, right? Imagination is soul expanding, but it also requires us to expand the definitions of ourselves and other people as well. So much of what I've experienced from folks in Skid Row is that they're willing to go to places of imagination and vulnerability and openness in ways that I am often not open to doing myself. And so it's to say that this work doesn't start by being about making homeless people less homeless. I think this work starts by being about humanizing ourselves and people we don't yet know. How do we do that? How do we come into conversation with one another? Music for me, personally, happened to be that key, because music was the way that I could offer the fullness of my gifts, and it continues to be my most honest offering. Lexi, when she was kind enough to introduce me, said the word sadhana, and sadhana in Sanskrit means daily practice or worship. And the way that I saw my parents make that daily offering was by offering fruit and flowers and incense to deities. For me, that offering happens to be music for people. And not just music for people in a hall, and not just music for people in a shelter. It's music for people. And sometimes that person might be me in a room, and I need to receive the music that's coming back at me through my instrument. So I'll pause there.
Yeah, I think that's so powerful. And I think this whole conversation and session is really boiled down to understanding humanity, whether that's our own or others, and really being in search of the truth of our connections with each other. And for our final question, I want to circle back a bit to the very first thing that we've talked about, which is that idea of questions, and looking at questions being more important than answers and asking better questions. So a lot of our conversations for In Search of Truth have been about this kind of curiosity, and how, as we as a society and we as an audience, foster that curiosity to begin asking better questions and move forward from this conversation.
Yeah, it's such a beautiful question. I'm always struck when we talk about the power of questions by the quote of the great Elie Wiesel, who says, embedded in the word question is the word quest. As long as we're asking questions of each other, we're having a conversation. But the moment that we offer an answer, the conversation ends. And so it's to say that mutual questing is really important. And I feel that curiosity really begins with listening and offering. It's this reciprocal loop of listening and offering. Will you be generous enough to offer your attention to someone? And sometimes, that curiosity comes in moments that feel kind of awkward. Like so often there's this thing of like, hey, you just said something really interesting. I don't get it. Could you tell me a little bit more about that? I don't even know if I agree or disagree. But I think that kind of openness to let someone say a bit more. What do you really mean? What is that? And I think, listening towards values is really important. I think kind of identifying values. I mean, again, to Emma's point, how do we find that silver lining of values? Maybe perhaps especially when we're getting a bad vibe from someone, or we disagree, or we know we disagree. Like, is there something that we can talk about? So I'm curious to always explore that. And then I always find that having some kind of offering, whether or not it's music, you know, sometimes the greatest gift we can offer someone is our attention. You know, really being present, really getting off our screens. I know many of us, we're all on screens right now, but disconnecting from the screen and looking someone in the eyes and tolerating the discomfort that makes us want to doom scroll and actually ask questions and engage. We can practice that all the time. You know, even on social media, for example, I've actually been practicing not scrolling and engaging, trying to engage on every post I see, you know, and if I can't really engage with the post, or, I mean, sure, if it's like puppies, you know, then I'm just like leaving hearts and claps, right? But if it's something that is interesting or something that is drawing me in, I actually want to pause. So I actually wonder if curiosity starts with pause. Don't scroll. Stop, you know, and ask. And maybe if we're just consuming and we're just scrolling, maybe we shouldn't be following.
That's a great sort of final message to leave us with. That is all the time that we have for questions, but I know that you had something that you wanted to share with our audience before we head out.
Yes, I did. And perhaps this is something that we share in a follow-up email, but I'm also just going to drop a link into the chat if I can get it to work. A few months ago in January, I was very generously invited to the Wende Museum to perform a really interesting program, which included the music of the Hungarian composer György Kurtag, the Estonian composer Arvo Pärt, and music written by Rina Esmail. And this was part of an ensemble of street symphony called the San Julian Consort. It was myself and an amazing percussionist named Chester Englander, who plays a really interesting Hungarian percussion instrument called the cimbalom. And part of our program was an arrangement of Pärt's Spiegel im Spiegel, which means mirrors in mirrors, or mirror in the mirrors. And it's actually... We performed it and recorded this piece at the Wende, and in fact we used one of the Wende installation props, the mirror, on which a lot of the questions were written as part of our recording. And so yesterday being not only World Music Day, but also the solstice, this is kind of my love letter to the planet. It's Arvo Pärt's Transcendent Spiegel im Spiegel, and I'm putting it into the chat now. I hope that you will all enjoy watching it. We also recorded our entire program, including the amazing works of Kurtag, and it was amazing to play at the Wende. What a beautiful acoustic. What a great place to make music. I cannot wait to be back and make music there again, but I would just love to offer this to all of you who have tuned in. I hope you'll enjoy listening to this music. Let's see.
Yes, I dropped it because I think it was sent just to the panelists and hosts, but now we're there. Thank you so much for sharing that with us and for being here with us today. This was really a wonderful experience. And thank you to our audience for joining us and for sharing your wonderful questions. Before we sign off, I just want to let everyone know that our next program will be on Wednesday, July 27th at 4 p.m. Pacific time with guest speaker Kristen Lambert, who is a mentalist, theatrical medium, and practicing witch, who is going to speak about truth and magic. A very exciting next session, and I really hope that you'll all be able to join us. So thank you, and we look forward to seeing you then. Bye, everyone.